The Mosasaurus you've seen on screen is nearly the size of a blue whale. The real one would fit inside that shot with room to spare. And shrinking it only makes it worse. Now look at the skull. Just the skull, beside a person. Teeth pointing backward into the throat. Teeth on the roof of the mouth too. Not a dinosaur. Not a whale. Not a shark. A lizard. The tail is wrong in every film. So is the skin. So probably is the blood. And the first naturalist to study this skull saw something far worse than any monster. Start underground. Not in a museum, not in a lab. In a tunnel cut into a hill outside a Dutch town called Maastricht, sometime in the 1780s, where men are quarrying soft white chalk out of the rock by lamplight because it makes good building stone. The walls are pale, the air is thick, and somewhere above their heads, in the ceiling of the gallery, something dark starts coming out of the white. It's a jaw, a long one. Long enough that when they finally get the block free and carry it into daylight, the thing is over a meter of solid rock with teeth in it, cones, heavy, curved, set in a bone beam that would look absurd on anything alive in the North Sea. Now here's the part that most people get wrong before we even begin. You assume that when this thing came out of the ceiling, somebody looked at it and thought, prehistoric sea monster, extinct predator, lost world. Nobody thought that. Nobody could. In the 1780s, extinct was not a settled idea. It was barely an idea at all. The default assumption across European natural history was that species don't just stop. Creation was full, creation was permanent. And if you found the bones of something you didn't recognize, the reasonable conclusion was that you hadn't looked hard enough at the world yet. So the question in front of them was not, what was this? It was, what is this? Present tense. Something out there. Still swimming. And they had answers. Good ones. A crocodile was the obvious call. Long jaw, conical teeth, big. The shape of the thing screams crocodile. If crocodile is the biggest jaw you've ever personally seen. That answer wasn't stupid. It was pattern matching against the available library, which is exactly what science does when it's short on data. A fish was suggested, also not stupid. The rock was marine. The animal was clearly a swimmer. A whale was the strongest answer. And we'll get to why in a minute, because the whale idea is the one that came closest to being right for all the wrong reasons. Every one of those guesses was reasonable. Hold on to that because it's the pattern for this entire story. The wrong reconstructions were almost never foolish. They were answers built from a smaller pile of evidence than the one we're standing on now. The specimen ended up in the hands of a local military surgeon named Hoffman, who collected fossils out of those quarries and understood he had something unusual. What happened next is where the popular version of the story gets dramatic. A canon of the local cathedral claiming ownership of the rock beneath his land, a lawsuit, and later the famous tale of 600 bottles of wine paid to a quarryman to hand it over. Historians have picked at those details for a long time, and a lot of it looks like legend accreting around an object that got famous. So treat the wine as folklore. Treat the rest carefully. What is not folklore is what happened in 1794. French revolutionary forces took Maastricht. The skull did not stay. It went to Paris, into the national collection as spoils. Sit with that for a second. Before this animal was a species, before it had a name, before anyone on Earth knew what class of vertebrate it belonged to, it was war loot, a crate, somebody's trophy, packed and hauled across a border by an army. It became a scientific object second. It was a possession first, and in Paris, it walked into the one room where it could not stay a mystery. Back up slightly, because the whale idea deserves its moment. The Dutch anatomist Petrus Camper looked at this thing and concluded it was a toothed whale. Now, From where we sit, that sounds like a swing and a miss. From where he sat, it was the sharpest answer available. Consider what he was working with. A marine animal, enormous, with a long jaw full of grabbing teeth and no living counterpart in any nearby sea. What in the known world is enormous, marine, toothed, and known to be strange? A whale? Sperm whales existed. Nobody had a better bin to put it in. The whale answer also solved the theological problem beautifully, and this is the part people skip. If it's a whale, it's alive. If it's alive, nothing has been lost. The ocean was the perfect hiding place for an inconvenient animal, and everyone knew it. You could not search the Atlantic. You could not drain the Pacific. For decades, the sea functioned as the universal excuse. Whatever bones you dug up, something like it might still be down there, somewhere nobody had been, which means a marine animal should have been the easiest fossil in Europe to explain away. It wasn't, and the reason is anatomy. Camper's son, Adrian, went back over the skull and came to a different conclusion, and then Georges Cuvier, the man who built comparative anatomy into a weapon, went over it again in Paris and closed the argument. This was not a whale. Whale jaws don't work like this. Whale teeth don't sit like this. The joint is wrong. The bone architecture is wrong. What the skull actually resembled, in feature after feature, was a lizard, a monitor lizard, the kind of animal that walks on land, on 4 legs, with a tongue that flicks. Except this one was longer than a room. Understand what that did to the room. A whale in a Dutch quarry is a curiosity. A lizard the size of a boat, out of marine chalk, with a mouth built for holding things underwater, is a category error. There is nothing like it in any ocean. There is nothing like it on any shore. You cannot point at the sea and say it's probably still out there, because a giant marine lizard is not a thing that hides. It's a thing that would be famous. So the excuse died. And this is why the skull matters more than the animal ever did on screen. Cuvier was already assembling a case that species end. His strongest material was elephants, fossil elephants that refused to match anything living. The Maastricht animal became part of a growing pile of evidence pointing at the same uncomfortable answer, and it pointed harder than most because it came from the one place people had been using as a loophole. The conclusion was not, here's a monster. The conclusion was, things die out, permanently. Whole kinds of life, gone, with no living version anywhere. And the record in the rock is a record of a world that has already ended and will not be coming back. That idea is now so ordinary that a child can say it. In the 1790s, it was a wrecking ball. It meant the fossil record wasn't a catalog of the present. It was a graveyard. And it meant that the Earth had a history, with chapters that closed. The animal that helped force that door open didn't even have a name yet. The name came later, decades later. In the 1820s, the English naturalist William Conybeare finally attached a label to it. Mosasaurus, lizard of the Meuse, named after the river that runs past the town where the quarry was. Not after the animal, not after the teeth, or the jaw, or the sea it hunted in, after a river. The species name honoring Hoffman came a few years after that, from Gideon Mantell. Roughly 40 years from the block hitting daylight to the thing having a name. 40 years of being an object, a trophy, a scandal, and a philosophical bomb. Before it was allowed to be an animal. And the rock it came out of got the bigger honor. The final stage of the Cretaceous, the last few million years of the age of dinosaurs, is called the Maastrichtian, named after that hill. The closing chapter of that entire world is named after the quarry, where this jaw was hanging out of a ceiling. So here's where we actually are. We know what it isn't. It isn't a crocodile. It isn't a whale. It isn't a fish. It isn't a dinosaur. and it never was. And the movies that put it in a stadium next to a T-Rex were making a taxonomic mistake 2 centuries after that mistake was corrected. We know it's a lizard, and that answer solves nothing. It makes everything worse, because a lizard is a land animal with the wrong lungs, the wrong limbs, the wrong tail, the wrong metabolism, and the wrong body plan for open ocean. And this one was the apex predator of the Cretaceous seas. The teeth in that Paris crate were the first clue that something had gone very strange. They belonged to an animal whose closest living relatives are sitting on rocks right now in the sun, eating eggs. How does that happen? Put a monitor lizard on a rock and watch it for a minute. It's maybe 1.5 meters of muscle and dry scales, sprawling on 4 legs, tongue flicking, tasting the air. It walks with its body swinging side to side because its limbs come out of its shoulders sideways, not underneath. It breathes air through lungs. It lays eggs in dirt. It sits in the sun because it cannot generate its own heat fast enough to matter. And if the sun goes away, it slows down and stops. That is the starting material. That is the animal that becomes the apex predator of every ocean on Earth. I want you to feel how bad that is, because marine reptile gets used as a single bin, and it's one of the most misleading phrases in popular science. People hear it and picture one vague category: old, scaly, wet, swimming, teeth. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, all filed together in the same drawer as if they're variations on a theme. They are not related in any useful sense. Ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs split off from the reptile family tree long before, took their own separate roads into the water, and had been out there for tens of millions of years already. Ichthyosaurs went in during the Triassic. They came out looking like dolphins. Plesiosaurs went in and came out as something with no analog at all, a body with 4 wings. Mosasaurs are not on either branch. Mosasaurs are squamates. That's the group containing every lizard and every snake alive right now. The gecko on a wall in Recife is a squamate. The iguana is a squamate. The monitor on that rock is a squamate. The ocean's last great Cretaceous predator files into the same group as the thing eating insects on your ceiling, and it showed up late, absurdly late. The sea had been full of large air-breathing reptile predators for something like 100 million years before lizards took a serious run at it. This wasn't a frontier, it was occupied territory. So the question stops being how big did it get and becomes something much sharper. How does a body designed for walking on hot ground and hiding under things end up owning open water? And doing it after all the good seats were taken. Start with what it had to give up. Limbs first. A lizard leg is a lever built to push against solid ground. Underwater, that's a liability. It's drag with joints in it. In the earliest mosasauroids, the ones we call a giallosaur grade, you can still see the compromise sitting in the bone. They're small. Some of them are around the size of that monitor. They have real legs, real feet, real toes, real joints, and they look like an animal that could still haul itself out onto a shore and mean it. That's the shoreline stage. Half in, half out. Then follow the same skeleton forward through the group and watch the leg get taken apart. The long bones shorten and thicken until they're stubs. The wrist and ankle lose their crisp joints and turn into a mash of blocky nodules. Then something genuinely strange happens. The fingers start adding extra bones. More segments per digit than a lizard has any business having. That's hyperphalangy, and it's what you get when evolution stops treating a hand as a hand and starts treating it as a frame. A set of struts to stretch tissue across. The paddle isn't a modified foot in any meaningful sense. It's a foot that has been overrun. Now notice the trap that creates. Once the limbs go, you cannot come back out. The animal has just deleted its own exit. Everything after this point has to happen in water: feeding, breathing, moving, mating, birth, all of it. Because there is no longer a body that works on land. That's the pattern to hold on to for this whole story. Every fix creates a new problem. Nothing is free. Bone density goes next. Look at cross-sections through the vertebrae and ribs of the later, more open-water mosasaurs, and the internal structure turns spongy. The dense, heavy bone of a land animal opening up into something lighter and more porous. In a lizard, that would be a pathology. Out there, it's a solution. Neutral buoyancy is a permanent, unpaid tax if you have to fight your own weight every second of your life. So the skeleton gives up its solidity, which means it gives up strength, which will matter later in a way I'd rather not spoil yet. And then there's the head, which is where the lizard refuses to disappear. A squamate skull is not a solid box. It's a set of struts with hinges in it. Bones that move relative to each other when the mouth opens. That's why a snake can swallow something wider than its own face. Mosasaur skulls kept that architecture, kept the loose bracing, kept a joint sitting partway along the lower jaw itself, so each side of the mandible could flex in the middle rather than staying rigid. We'll come back to what that joint actually does. Right now, just log it. The ocean's biggest predator was walking around with a mouth built on lizard rules, and lizard rules are not like anybody else's. Which brings up the fight, because the exact relationship here is not settled, and it's one of the better arguments in vertebrate paleontology. One camp puts mosasaurs closest to monitor lizards. Varanoids. Big, active, sharp, predatory lizards. And the skull comparisons line up in a lot of places. That was Cuvier's read, in essence, and it's held up well enough to still be defended. The other camp puts them closer to snakes. Same nested group called Pythonomorpha, and the evidence there isn't nothing. That mid-jaw joint, the palate, the general loose-skulled architecture that snakes took to an extreme. Under that model, a mosasaur isn't a swimming monitor. It's something on the branch that also produced the animals that swallow prey whole. Both readings have real support. Analyses keep shifting depending on which characters get weighted and which fossils get added, and honest people go back and forth. Do not let anyone tell you it's decided. It isn't. What everyone agrees on is the part that matters here. The thing is a lizard, all the way down, and it never stopped being one. Which leaves an uncomfortable little hole in the reconstruction. That tongue. The one flicking on the rock. A monitor lizard smells the world with it. Flicks, collects chemical traces from the air, delivers them to a sensory organ in the roof of the mouth. Snakes do the same. It's one of the defining tricks of the whole group. So did a mosasaur do it underwater? We don't know. Tongues are muscle. Muscle rots. There's no fossilized mosasaur tongue sitting in a drawer waiting to settle it, and the argument runs on indirect evidence and comparison. Some snakes do use tongue flicking underwater. Whether a giant marine lizard was tasting the water column ahead of it or had abandoned the whole system is a genuine open question. That gap in the record is going to come back to bite us hard several chapters from now, when we try to work out how this animal found anything at all. Now step back and look at what we've actually built. Not a dolphin. It couldn't be. Dolphins come from a lineage that had already spent 100 million years as warm-running, fast-metabolizing mammals with a spine that flexes vertically. So when mammals went to sea, they got a tail that beats up and down. Ichthyosaurs came from reptiles with a horizontally flexing spine, so they got a tail that beats side to side like a fish. Mosasaurs came from lizards, and a lizard runs by throwing its spine into S-curves, side to side, the same motion it uses to walk. The ocean didn't get to pick the raw material. It only got to edit what was handed to it. So you end up with an animal solving the problems of open water using parts scavenged off a land reptile, a lizard's spine, a lizard's kinetic skull, a lizard's lungs, a lizard's teeth, all being hammered into a shape that has to compete with things that got a 200 million year head start. It should have been a footnote, a weird coastal experiment that fizzled. Instead, in a geological blink, mosasaurs are in every ocean on the planet, in dozens of forms, at the top of everything. That's a story I'm coming back to because how fast it happened is one of the most disturbing numbers in this entire video. First, though, we have to deal with the number everyone thinks they already know: the size. Because the figure you've heard is doing something dishonest. And the way it got that big has almost nothing to do with fossils. Line them up as silhouettes on black, and the argument is over before it starts. Blue whale, 30 meters, give or take. The largest animal that has ever existed as far as we know. 150 tons of it. The screen Mosasaurus, right there next to it. Same order of magnitude. In the later films, it's swallowing things whole that a blue whale couldn't fit in its mouth, and the franchise's own numbers kept sliding upward between movies, which tells you something. The animal grew because the shots needed it to, not because anything came out of the ground. Now the real one. It goes in the same frame and it looks like a mistake. A dark shape, maybe a third the length of the whale, closer in scale to a killer whale that got greedy. If you were standing on a boat and it surfaced next to you, you would not think kaiju. You'd think that is a very large animal and it is far too close. That's the correction. And I know exactly what it feels like when the number drops. It feels like a letdown. It feels like the science guy showed up to ruin the poster. Stay with me, because the shrink is the most important thing that happens in this entire reconstruction, and here's why. At 30 meters, the animal is a prop. Nothing constrains it. It doesn't have to obey anything. At 12 meters, every single part of it has to work. It has to eat enough. It has to breathe. It has to accelerate. It has to survive being bitten by things its own size. The moment you shrink it, it stops being a design and becomes an organism. And organisms are worse because organisms are real. So how big was it actually? Here's where I have to be honest with you in a way the movies never are. The answer is a range, not a number. A range and a wide one. And the width of that range is the story. Published estimates for Mosasaurus hoffmanni, the Maastricht animal, the one this whole thing is named after, land somewhere between roughly 11 and 17 meters, depending on whose method you're using. That's not a rounding disagreement. The top end is more than 50% longer than the bottom end. Imagine a mammal where we couldn't agree whether it was the size of a horse or a small barn. And the reason for that gap is the thing I want you to see, because once you see it, you can never unsee it in any prehistoric size claim ever again. We have the head. We're guessing the rest. Go back to that block of chalk in Paris. It's a jaw. Later material filled in more of the skull. And there's more Mosasaurus out there now. Teeth, vertebrae, fragments, partial material from several continents. What there isn't for hoffmanni specifically is the thing you'd actually want. A complete, articulated, nose-to-tail tip skeleton of a big adult, lying in the rock in one piece, settling the question forever. So the number gets built by proxy. You take the skull, which you have. You measure it. Then you apply a ratio. Roughly, how many times longer is the whole animal than its own head? And you multiply. Sounds fine. It's not fine. That ratio has to come from somewhere, and where it comes from is other mosasaurs. Relatives. Genera we do have decent skeletons for, so you're measuring one animal's head and stretching a different animal's body onto it. Now ask the obvious question. Do all mosasaurs have the same proportions? They do not. Some are long and slim. Some are compact bruisers with heads that look oversized for their bodies. Pick a slim relative as your yardstick, and your Mosasaurus comes out enormous. Pick a stocky one and it comes out 50% shorter from the exact same skull. The bone didn't change. The assumption did. That's the whole mechanism. That's why the number keeps moving. Not new fossils. New decisions about which cousin to trust. And it gets worse because length is the least useful measurement you can take off a predator. Length is a line. Animals aren't lines. What actually governs everything, how fast it can accelerate, how much it has to eat, how deep it can go, what it can bite without breaking its own face, is mass. And mass is where the estimates go from shaky to almost embarrassing. Published weights for large mosasaurs vary by multiples, not percentages, because mass is calculated from body volume, and body volume is reconstructed from a torso we don't have. Here's why that difference is savage instead of academic. Scale an animal up and length grows on one axis while mass grows on three. Double the length, and if the shape stays the same, you're not carrying twice as much. You're carrying about 8 times as much, which means the gap between an 11-meter Mosasaurus and a 17-meter Mosasaurus is not a bit bigger. It's potentially a 3 to 4-fold difference in the animal's entire energy bill. Different prey, different hunting range, different everything. We don't know which of those animals we're talking about. We're not close, and the shape argument matters more than the length argument, which is the part that got buried under the size hype. Whatever the exact figure, the consensus on build is clearer. Hoffmanni was heavy, robust jaw, deep, thick skull bones, teeth that aren't delicate. This is not a fine-boned racing animal. Compare it to some of its relatives, the long-snouted ones built like javelins. And Mosasaurus reads as the linebacker of the group, shorter than the hype, denser than expected, and carrying a head engineered for something that resisted. That build tells you more about how it lived than any length ever could. A slim animal is cheap to move and cheap to feed, and it's telling you it hunts things that run. A robust animal with a reinforced skull is telling you it hunts things that fight back, or things that are armored, or both, and that it's paying a real cost in drag and mass to be able to do it. Nothing carries that much bone in its face for fun. Bone is expensive. Bone is heavy. Bone has to be justified. Then there's the twist nobody expects, which is that Mosasaurus might not even be the biggest one. For a long stretch of the 20th century, the crown was widely handed to Tylosaurus, a different genus, known from far better skeletons, and a genuinely huge animal in its own right, up around the 14-meter mark, depending on the specimen and the estimate. Other contenders have been argued for over the years. The biggest mosasaur title has been passed around, revoked, and reassigned more than once, and where it lands today depends heavily on which fragmentary specimen you're willing to extrapolate from and how generous you're feeling. Sit with the implication. The animal the entire group is named after, the one that got the movie, the one whose skull broke the concept of extinction, might have been sharing its ocean with rivals of comparable size that just had worse publicity. It was not alone up there, and the reason it got famous first has nothing to do with being the largest. It got famous because a quarry in Holland happened to have soft chalk and good preservation and a war passing through. Fame is an accident of geology. So here's where we've landed. The size is a range, not a fact. The range exists because we're scaling a head we have onto a body we don't. The build says heavy, not long. And every headline number you've ever seen, including the ones from museums, including the ones I've just given you, is a calculation wearing the costume of a measurement. That's the honest version. 11 to 17 meters. Probably heavy. Probably not the biggest thing in its own family. An animal you could fit comfortably inside the frame next to a blue whale with room to spare on both sides. And the movie's got that wrong, sure. Fine. Length is easy to argue about, and honestly, It's the least interesting mistake they made, because there's something else in that silhouette that's wrong. And it isn't a matter of degree. It isn't too big or too small. It's a piece of the animal that every reconstruction on Earth, every museum mount, every textbook drawing, every film, got structurally, fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong for more than 150 years. It's the back half. And the evidence that fixed it had been sitting in the fossils the entire time, in plain view, being explained away as damage. Look at any Mosasaurus skeleton, mounted before about 15 years ago, and follow the spine backward. It runs clean out of the hips, tapering, vertebra after vertebra, getting smaller, getting simpler. And then, near the end, it does something. It bends, down, a distinct kink in the column, sitting there in the bone, where the last stretch of tail angles below the line of the body. That kink is in the fossils. It's been in the fossils since people started pulling mosasaurs out of chalk. It's not subtle. You can see it from across a room. And for over a century, the standard read on it was damage, crushing, post-mortem distortion, a carcass settling into sediment, the tail sagging, the rock compacting on top of it over millions of years and pushing the end of the spine out of true. Which is a completely defensible thing to think, because that does happen constantly. Fossils get squashed, skeletons get warped. Half the job of reading a specimen is working out which bends are the animal and which bends are the burial. So the mounts got built straight, the illustrations got drawn straight, the tail came off the hips and went back in one long taper to a point, and the animal that resulted swam like an eel. That was the picture. A giant marine snake with flippers, undulating its whole body through the water in big, lazy S-curves, the way a sea snake does, the way a lizard does when it swims across a river. It made total sense. It came out of the anatomy, honestly. If it's a lizard, and lizards swim by throwing their spine into waves, then a very large lizard swims by, throwing a very large spine into very large waves. Every part of that reasoning is sound. And it's wrong. Here's what broke it. Occasionally, rarely, under conditions that have to be almost perfect, a marine animal dies and hits a seafloor with no oxygen and no scavengers, and the sediment is fine enough, and the chemistry is right, and instead of only the bones surviving, the outline of the body survives, soft tissue, a stain in the rock where the flesh was, skin, body margins, the actual silhouette of a thing that has been dead for 70 million years. That has happened for mosasaurs. Not many times, but it has happened. And when those specimens got examined properly, the outline around the tail didn't taper to a point. There was a blade there, a broad flange of tissue standing off the spine, extending above and below the bone, filling out the back end of the animal into something with surface area. And the kink wasn't damage. The kink was structural. The downturned run of vertebrae was the support strut inside the lower half of a fluke, which means the animal had a tail fin. Not an eel's taper, not a lizard's whip, a two-lobed vertical fin, the general architecture you see on a shark, sitting on the end of a lizard. Go and look at what that does to the mounts. Museums worldwide have been rebuilding. The old skeletons, straight-tailed, are being reworked or reflagged, and the new reconstructions come off the wall looking like a different class of animal. Same bones, same species. The vertebrae never moved. Somebody just finally read the bend correctly. I want to flag something honestly here because it's exactly the kind of thing this story keeps doing. The best soft tissue evidence for the fluke doesn't come from Mosasaurus itself. It comes from other mosasaur genera, relatives, sharing the same body plan, showing the same tail bend in the bone. So the reconstruction is an inference, not a photograph. The kink in Mosasaurus is there. The soft tissue that explains what a kink like that means is from cousins. That's a legitimate argument, and it's how comparative anatomy has always worked. But it's still an argument. And the precise shape of the fin, how tall, how deep, how symmetrical, is being reconstructed, not observed. Nobody has the fin. We have the strut and the stain. Now, why does this matter more than the size did? Because it changes what the animal was for. An eel swimmer moves its whole body. Every segment of that spine is flexing. Every flex is pushing water sideways, and a lot of that push is wasted shoving the animal's own front end around. It works. It's efficient at low speed. It's precise. It's great for maneuvering in tight water. What it isn't good at is going fast in a straight line over distance. The drag penalty of waving your entire torso is brutal. A fluke does the opposite. Stiffen the front of the body, concentrate the motion at the back, and put the thrust into one dedicated blade. The head stays still. The torso stops fighting itself. All the force comes out of one point at the rear, and now you have an animal that can hold a line, cruise cheaply, and, this is the part that matters, accelerate. That's the profile of a pursuit predator or an ambusher that needs to close a gap fast. And notice what evolution just did here. Sharks have this. Ichthyosaurs had this. Tuna have this. Now mosasaurs have it, arrived at from a completely unrelated starting point, a four-legged land lizard, with none of the same equipment and none of the same ancestry. That's convergence. And convergence is one of the few things in biology that feels almost like a threat. It means the ocean has a correct answer. It means if you want to move fast through water at that size, there's essentially one shape that works, and the water will keep forcing lineage after lineage into it no matter what they walked in with. Give it enough time and the sea will file anything down into the same silhouette. But hold on, there's a cost buried in this, and it's the thing the fluke story usually skips. Go back to the spine. A tail fluke only works if the body in front of it is relatively stiff. The whole point is that you're not wasting energy undulating. So the vertebral column has to brace. It has to resist bending in the middle while transmitting force to the back. That's a structural demand. And structural demands get paid in bone. Remember what we said about bone density? These animals had gone spongy in places, lightened, traded solidity for buoyancy. So now you've got a skeleton that's been deliberately weakened for flotation being asked to act as a rigid drive shaft for a fin that's throwing serious force. That's a compromise. Not a solution, a compromise. Something in that arrangement is under load every second the animal is moving. Something is going to break. And it's going to show up in the bones in a way you will not be ready for. Just not yet. Meanwhile, look at what the corrected shape does to the animal on screen. The films have it moving like a crocodile. Big lateral sweeps, the whole body waving. A lot of theatrical thrash. That's the discarded model. That's a reconstruction that was retired while those movies were being made, still being animated, because it looks like what an audience thinks a sea monster does. The real motion is worse to be on the receiving end of. It's quieter. A stiffer body, less visible flailing. Most of the work happening at the back of the animal, where you can't see it. Less thrash, more closing speed. And here's the last twist, the one that reframes the whole chapter. Everyone assumed the fluke was some late refinement, the finished product, the top-of-the-line version at the end of the lineage. But when you look across the group, the tail bend turns up more widely than that. It's not just the big terminal forms. The architecture shows up earlier and more broadly than the old story allowed, which suggests the fluke wasn't the last thing mosasaurs figured out. It might have been one of the first, which changes the order of the whole conquest. They didn't slowly become good swimmers over 30 million years and then take the ocean. They may have solved propulsion early and then spread. So the tale was a lie. The eel is gone. The animal has a fin. But run this back one more time because there's a loose thread hanging off it that's bigger than the tail. That evidence came from a body outline, a shadow of soft tissue in the rock. If the rock was fine enough to record where the flesh ended and the water began, what else was in that stain? Because the tissue didn't just preserve a shape, it preserved a surface. And that surface is the second thing every film gets wrong, right on the very outside of the animal, where you'd think there'd be nothing left to argue about. The stain didn't stop at the outline. Zoom in on it. Under magnification, the tissue in some of these specimens isn't a smear. It's textured. It has a grain. Rows and rows of small, regular shapes pressed into the sediment, packed tight against each other, running in ordered lines across the body like fabric. Scales. Fossilized scale impressions, in place, on the animal, 70-odd million years old. And they are not what you've been shown. Picture the screen version's hide for a second. Lumpy, armored. Big knobby plates, deep folds, scutes like a crocodile's back. A texture that says reptile to an audience, because crocodile is the reptile everyone has seen. It reads as ancient and heavy and dangerous. Now the real surface. The scales are small, diamond-shaped, roughly packed edge to edge in diagonal rows, and this is the part that stops people. They're keeled. Each one carries a raised ridge running down its middle, so the whole animal is covered in millions of tiny parallel lines. Small, tight, ridged, not armor, nothing like armor. Same honesty flag as the tail. The best of this material comes from mosasaur relatives, not from Mosasaurus hoffmanni itself. We're reading a family and applying it to a member. That's a legitimate inference, and it's how this works. But you should know which parts are photograph and which parts are argument. So why does it matter that the scales are small? Because size of scale is a hydrodynamics problem. And hydrodynamics is a fuel problem. And fuel is the only thing that ever really matters out there. Water is roughly 800 times denser than air. Every square centimeter of an animal's surface is dragging against it constantly. And the shape of that surface at millimeter scale decides how the water behaves as it flows past. Big, irregular plates create turbulence, swirls, eddies, chaos in the boundary layer, all of it costing energy. A fine, regular, tightly packed surface keeps that flow organized. Less mess, less drag, cheaper to move. Every kilometer this thing swam, it was paying a bill. The skin was negotiating the rate. And the keels do something else, something more interesting than drag. A ridged surface scatters light instead of bouncing it back clean. Take a smooth, wet animal in sunlit water and it will flash. A slab of reflected sun off the flank visible from a long way off. That flash is a broadcast. It tells everything in the neighborhood exactly where you are and exactly how big you are. Millions of tiny ridges break that reflection apart. No flash. No signature. Which is the first hint that we're not looking at a monster's costume. We're looking at a system for not being seen. Then the pigment work landed, and the picture got a lot more specific. Here's how that even became possible, because it sounds like it shouldn't be. Color in an animal's skin comes partly from melanin, and melanin sits inside microscopic containers called melanosomes. Tiny sausage-shaped structures, well under 1,000th of a millimeter long. Under exceptional preservation, those structures can survive in fossil tissue, not the color, the containers. And in some fossil skin, the chemical traces of the melanin itself. So you take a sliver of preserved mosasaur skin, put it under an electron microscope and count. Are melanosomes there? How densely packed. And you run chemical analysis to check whether the residue matches eumelanin, the pigment that makes things black and dark brown. The answer that came back from mosasaur skin, dense, loaded, packed with pigment structures and chemistry consistent with eumelanin, in quantities that say this was a dark animal. But not evenly. The distribution was uneven across the body, heavy on the back, sparse on the underside, dark on top, pale below. That's counter shading, and I need you to understand it isn't decoration, and it isn't a coincidence, because half the ocean is wearing it right now. Sharks have it. Tuna have it. Dolphins, penguins, whales. It's not a fashion. It's the solution to a specific geometric problem. And the problem is this. In open water, there is nowhere to hide. So the only camouflage available is to break the two directions anyone can look at you from. Look down at an animal from above and the backdrop is the deep, blue, going to black. A pale animal against that is a hole in the dark, obvious. A dark back merges into it. Look up at an animal from below, and the backdrop is the surface, lit up, bright, a ceiling of glare. A dark animal against that is a silhouette, and silhouettes are the easiest targets in the sea. A pale belly cancels it. The animal goes translucent against the light. So the animal is not one color. It's two solutions, glued together at the flanks, each pointed at a different observer. Now here's the line I want to land, and it's the one that reframes everything you thought this creature was. The pale belly is the lethal part, because a dark back is defensive. It hides you from things looking down at you. Bigger mosasaurs, sharks, whatever else was operating in that water. Fine, but a pale belly hides you from things looking up. And what's below you looking up? Fish, turtles, anything shallower than you are, prey. You don't camouflage your underside against the sky for fun. You do it because your entire hunting method involves being below something and coming up, and you need the last thing it sees to be nothing at all. That's not a monster's paint job. That's an ambush animal's paint job. The color scheme is a confession about the hunt. There's a second read on the dark back, and it's worth flagging because it points somewhere we're going later. Dark surfaces absorb heat. An animal spending time near the surface with a black back is soaking up solar energy, and depending on how this animal ran internally, that could be a thermal strategy rather than only a visual one. Hold that thought. It becomes important in a way that isn't comfortable. Now the uncertainty, because I'm not going to sell you more than the evidence supports. Melanosome interpretation has real critics. The structures are tiny, and there are people who've argued that some of what gets identified as fossil melanosomes could be microbial. Bacteria that colonize the carcass. Similar size, similar shape. The chemical evidence pushes back on that hard, and the field has largely moved forward. But it's an argument that happened, and it shaped how carefully the claims get made. And even taking it all at face value, look at exactly what we've got. Tone. Dark versus light. Distribution across the body, not pattern. Not stripes, spots, bands, saddles, blazes, not hue. Whether it was black, deep brown, dark gray, or something with a color cast we'd have a name for, gone. A dark back tells you where the pigment was concentrated. It doesn't paint the picture. So the honest reconstruction is a dark-backed, pale-bellied animal of unknown pattern, covered in millions of small, ridged scales, moving without flashing, hard to see from above, invisible from below. Compare that against the screen version one more time. The films give you an armored thing that leaps, thrashes, and displays. A spectacle. Something that wants to be seen, because of course it does. The whole point of putting it on screen is to look at it. The evidence gives you the opposite animal. Every feature on its outside is aimed at deletion. It's built to erase itself in whichever direction you happen to be looking from. Whatever this thing did to what it ate, the eating probably began with nothing happening at all, in water that appeared empty for as long as the geometry held. The movie made it a monster. The skin says it was a disappearance. So now we've got the shape, the motion, and the surface. And every one of them contradicts what you've been shown. But there's still one feature sitting on that back in every single fictional version, and it's the feature that makes the design read as a dragon: the spines. That saw blade fringe running down the spine from skull to tail. It isn't on any of these specimens. It's not in the tissue, it's not in the bone. So where the hell did it come from? Because it didn't come from nowhere. Somebody drew it once for a reason that made sense at the time. And it turns out that reason involves a piece of anatomy that had absolutely nothing to do with the animal's back. It's not nothing. That's the first thing you need to know: the frill. That ridge of soft spikes running down the back of every fictional mosasaur. The thing that makes the design read as a dragon rather than an animal is not something a concept artist hallucinated over coffee. It has a paper trail. It goes back to a real fossil, examined by real people, who published a real interpretation in good faith. They just got it wrong, and the wrong version escaped. Here's the fossil. Early 20th century, a mosasaur comes out of chalk, in remarkable condition. Not just bones, but skin. That same rare, soft tissue preservation we've been leaning on for the tail and the scales. Exceptional specimen. The kind of thing a collector waits a career for. And lying along the back of it, in the rock, is a row of structures, segmented, repeating, sitting roughly where a spinal ridge would sit if the animal had one. Put yourself in that room. You have an enormous marine lizard, an animal nobody has ever seen alive, an animal whose closest living relatives are things like monitors and iguanas. And what do a lot of lizards have running down their backs? A crest, a fringe, a row of soft spines. Iguanas have it. Basilisks have it. It's a common squamate feature. So you've got a lizard, you've got a row of segmented structures along the spine, and you've got a whole family of living animals that wear exactly that. The conclusion writes itself. This thing had a dorsal frill. That is not a foolish inference. That is a good inference. Given the evidence on the table, I'd have made it too. The reconstruction went out. Illustrations got drawn, and the frill was perfect. Visually, it solved a problem nobody had articulated. A mosasaur without it is a big smooth torpedo, and smooth torpedoes don't look scary. They look like fish. Add a serrated ridge down the spine, and suddenly the thing has menace. It has a profile. It reads as a monster in silhouette, which is exactly what an illustrator, and later an animator, desperately needs. So the frills spread. Book covers, museum panels, documentaries, toys. Every generation copying the last, because the source of every mosasaur illustration is mostly other mosasaur illustrations. And eventually a film franchise picks it up and puts it in a stadium, and now 500 million people know what a mosasaur looks like. Decades later, somebody went back and looked at the specimen again, and the structures weren't on the back. Look closely at what they actually are. Segmented rings of cartilage, stacked in a row, forming a flexible tube. Now, where does an animal keep a flexible tube made of stacked cartilage rings? Its throat. Put your fingers on the front of your own neck and you can feel them. Tracheal rings, the reinforcing hoops that keep your windpipe from collapsing every time you inhale. Every air-breathing vertebrate has them, and in a large marine reptile, they'd be substantial, sturdy structures. Exactly the sort of thing that might survive when other soft tissue doesn't. That's what was in the rock, not a crest. A windpipe. Here's how it ended up on the back. When a big animal dies in water, it does not stay in anatomical order. It floats. It bloats. Gas builds in the body cavity. The carcass rolls, tissue softens, and things migrate. The trachea is a long tube sitting loose in the neck, and as the throat decays, there is nothing holding it in position. It slides. The animal settles into sediment in whatever configuration it happened to be in when it hit the bottom, and the trachea ends up displaced, lying alongside the spine, running in a neat line, looking for all the world like it belongs there. Then, the sediment locks it in place, and the rock keeps it for 70 million years in exactly the wrong spot. I love this one, and I'll tell you why. Nobody lied. Nobody was lazy. The evidence was genuinely ambiguous. The comparison to living lizards was genuinely reasonable, and the reinterpretation only became possible once people had more soft tissue mosasaurs to compare against and a better understanding of what carcasses do when they rot in seawater. The old answer wasn't stupid. It was the best available answer from a smaller pile of evidence. Same as the crocodile, same as the whale, same as the eel tail. The correction is old news now. It's been out there for decades. The frill is gone from serious reconstructions. It has not gone anywhere else. It is still on your screen. It was on your screen last year, which means the movie Mosasaur isn't quoting the animal. It's quoting a 100-year-old misreading of a windpipe, carried forward by inertia, because the mistake looks better than the correction does. Now here's the second argument, and it's the one that would have killed the frill even without the fossil reassessment. Physics. Go back to what we established about that tail. This animal has a fluke. It has a stiffened body concentrating thrust at the back end. That is the anatomy of something built to hold a line and close distance at speed. And every gram of drag it carries is a direct tax on that. Remember the skin? Millions of tiny keeled scales, packed tight, specifically organized to keep water flowing clean and quiet along the body. That's an animal negotiating its drag build down to the millimeter. Now bolt a tall serrated ridge onto the top of it. The instant the animal turns, or rolls, or takes water at any angle other than dead on, that ridge becomes a wall. It grabs water. It generates turbulence exactly where the body was trying not to. It's a sail on an animal that is spending its entire evolutionary budget trying to disappear into flow. And what does it buy? That's the question that ends the argument. Drag is a real cost paid constantly every second of a life. So a structure like that has to earn its keep. On land, a crest earns it. Display, thermoregulation, species recognition, visual signaling in air where everyone can see everything. Underwater, in an animal whose entire outer surface is a countershaded, non-reflective disappearing act, display makes no sense. You do not build camouflage that good and then stick a flag on it. Those two strategies are at war. The frill doesn't just lack evidence, it contradicts the rest of the animal. There is one honest caveat, and I'll give it to you. Soft tissue mostly doesn't fossilize. An absence of evidence in soft tissue is weak evidence of absence. Could a mosasaur have had some low ridge somewhere that we've simply never caught? Possibly. We can't disprove a modest structure that never made it into rock. What we can say is that the specific evidence that launched the frill has been reassessed and reallocated to the throat, and that the physics runs against a large one, and that no other mosasaur soft tissue specimen has produced anything to replace it. So the honest position is, the reason to believe in the frill has evaporated, and the reason to doubt it is structural. Step back and look at what we've actually done over the last few minutes. Because it's the important part, we've traced a monster to its source. The dragon fringe on the most famous prehistoric sea creature in popular culture comes from a decomposing throat that slid up a spine and got buried in the wrong place. That's it. That's the origin of the monster. And here's what gets me. The films added a fake structure to the outside of this animal, a piece of drag with no function built for silhouette, while the actual structure that would have made it genuinely frightening on screen was sitting somewhere they never bothered to look. Not the back, not the surface, not anywhere you'd see from the outside at all. Open the mouth and turn the skull over. Look up into the roof of it. There is a second set of teeth in there. They're smaller than the ones on the jaw. They're pointing backward, into the throat, and they are not for chewing. Take the skull off the mount and flip it. Nobody does this. Every photograph of a mosasaur skull is a profile shot. Side on, jaws open, the big conical teeth lined up along the margin like a set of tent pegs. That's the money shot. That's what sells the poster. Turn it upside down and look straight up into the roof of the mouth. There's another set of teeth in there. 2 rows of them, running back along the palate on either side of the midline, sitting on a pair of bones called the pterygoids. They're smaller than the jaw teeth, sharper in profile, recurved, hooked backward, pointing down and in toward the throat. Teeth in the roof of the mouth, not at the edges, in the middle of the palate, where nothing bites. That's the feature. That's the thing no film has ever shown you. And once you understand what it does, the movie version stops being wrong and starts being childish. Because here's the assumption we all carry. Predator equals Jaws. Big mouth closes, big teeth go in. Done. The bite is the event. Everything before it is the chase, and everything after it is chewing. That model is fine for a lion. It's fine for a crocodile. It is completely useless for this animal. And the palate teeth are the proof. Start with what those teeth can't do. They're not on the jaw margin. They can't participate in the initial bite. Nothing gets contacted by the roof of the mouth on the way in. They only touch prey that is already inside, which means their entire function happens after the moment everyone thinks the hunt ends. And they point backward. That's the tell. A backward-hooked tooth has exactly one job in the entire animal kingdom, and it isn't cutting. It's ratcheting. Think about the mechanics for a second. Something struggling in a mouth can move 2 ways, further in or back out. A backward-pointing hook offers essentially 0 resistance in one direction and bites hard in the other. Push against it and it slides. Pull away from it and it sets. It's a one-way valve, and this one is made of enamel and bone. So, the prey thrashes. Every thrash toward the throat is free. Every thrash away from it hits a wall of hooks that dig in. The animal doesn't have to hold on with strength. It has to let physics do the work while the thing kills itself trying to escape. Now add the second piece. And this is where a lizard stops being a lizard you recognize. Your lower jaw is one bone, solid, fused at the chin, a single rigid U. When you bite, the whole thing moves as one unit. Most mammals work this way. It's good for grinding, and it's good for force. Squamates don't do that. A lizard's lower jaw is a chain of separate bones, and in mosasaurs, there's a joint sitting part way along each side of the mandible, the intramandibular joint. It's a hinge in the middle of the lower jaw, which means each side of the jaw can flex, not just open and close at the back, bend. In the middle, independently, stop and picture what that gives you. The mouth isn't a clamp anymore. It's an assembly of parts that can move relative to each other. Left side, right side, front, back, roof. 5 or 6 semi-independent surfaces, most of them carrying teeth. Most of those teeth pointing the same direction, down the throat. Now run the sequence and understand that this is inference from architecture, not filmed behavior. What the anatomy permits is grip, then advance. One side releases and reaches forward while the other holds. The palate teeth engage and drag. The released side sets again further along. Repeat. The mouth doesn't crush the prey inward. It walks it inward, hand over hand, with teeth instead of hands. Snakes do a version of this. That's where the comparison comes from, and that's where the honesty flag has to go up. because the degree matters enormously and the degree is argued about. Snakes are the extreme case. A snake's skull is a suspension of loosely connected struts, and the lower jaws aren't even joined at the front. They're linked by elastic tissue, so each half swings independently around prey wider than the snake's own head. That is full-blown cranial kinesis, taken to the limit. Nobody serious is claiming a mosasaur did that. The skull is heavier, more braced, more consolidated than a snake's. Some researchers argue mosasaur skulls were substantially kinetic. Real movement at multiple joints, real snake-like function. Others argue the big forms had stiffened up considerably, that the mid-jaw joint was more about absorbing shock from a struggling animal than about walking food down a throat. There's experimental and modeling work in both directions, and the honest summary is the joint is definitely there, the teeth are definitely there, and how much the whole apparatus moved in life is genuinely unresolved. But even the conservative version is bad news for anything in that mouth. Even a modest amount of flex, combined with 2 extra rows of backward hooks in the roof, means that prey inside there is dealing with a mechanism, not a clamp. Which brings up the second misconception, and it's the one that surprises people most. Look at the jaw teeth again. The big ones, the ones on the poster. What are they shaped like? Cones. Robust, thick-walled cones with facets, curved slightly back, coming to a point. Not blades. There's no long cutting edge. No serrated shearing surface running down the tooth like a steak knife. Compare that to a great white. A shark tooth is a triangular blade with serrations along both margins, mounted in a jaw designed to saw. A white shark bites and then shakes its head laterally, and the teeth work like a bandsaw, and a chunk comes off. That's a slicing system. It exists to remove a portion from an animal far too large to swallow. Mosasaurus doesn't have any of that. The teeth puncture and hold. They're grippers, which means this animal wasn't carving pieces off things. It was taking things whole. Now everything snaps together. Why would you evolve a second set of teeth in the roof of your mouth? Because everything you eat has to fit down your throat, and the throat is the bottleneck, and the entire mouth needs to be a conveyor pointed at it. Why hooks instead of blades? Because you're not reducing prey. You're transporting it. Why a hinge in the jaw? Because a rigid mouth can only hold what it can close on, and a jointed one can reposition. The whole head is one machine, and the machine is a funnel. There's a detail here I keep coming back to. Mosasaur teeth were replaced continuously through life, in the way squamate teeth generally are. New teeth developing and moving in beneath old ones. So the system was self-maintaining. A tooth breaking off in a struggling turtle is a maintenance event, not a crisis. That tells you something about the frequency of the violence. You don't build a permanently regenerating grip system for an animal that fights rarely. So let's put it back together. Something is caught. It's inside a mouth roughly the length of a person, in water, at depth, and it cannot see. The jaw teeth have punctured and set. Every struggle drives it backward past 2 additional rows of hooks it never knew were there. The sides of the jaw are flexing, advancing, resetting. And there is no reverse gear anywhere in the system. Not one tooth in that entire mouth points the way out. The scary part was never how big the mouth was. It's that the mouth had a direction. Meanwhile, the fictional version opens wide, snaps shut, and swallows a person in one theatrical gulp. Clean, simple, a trap door with teeth on it. It's a monster designed by people who thought bite was the whole story, when the actual evidence describes something with a process. But here's the problem, and it's a real one. Sitting right at the front of this whole mechanism, ratcheting only works if the initial grab holds. All of it. The palate teeth, the flexing jaw, the whole conveyor, is downstream of one moment. The moment the jaws close on something that does not want to be closed on. A turtle with a shell. A shark. Another mosasaur. If that first bite slips, nothing else happens. So how hard could it actually bite? And what happens to a skull built out of lightened, spongy, buoyancy-optimized bone when it clamps down on something armored? That number is not what you think it is. And the way we got it is worse. Put a mosasaur tooth in your hand. Not a shark tooth. Everyone knows what a shark tooth feels like. Thin, flat, edged. The whole thing basically a blade with a root. You could shave with a good one. The mosasaur tooth is wrong in your palm. It's heavy. It's thick. It's a cone that's been slightly flattened and faceted, so it has flat planes running down its length like a chisel that decided to become a spike. The walls are dense. The tip is sharp, but the body is not delicate anywhere. It weighs like a tool. And in a lot of them, there are two edges, carinae, front and back, running down the cone. Sometimes with fine serrations on them, depending on the species, depending on the position in the jaw. That's a puncturing instrument that got a little bit of cutting glued on as an afterthought. It's not the reverse. Now here's the assumption that's been quietly running underneath every mosasaur documentary you've ever seen. Big marine predator equals shark analog. Same job, same solution. Bite, shake, tear, chunk. The teeth say no. Look at a great white system again. Serrated triangle. Mounted loose in a jaw that's not even solidly attached to the skull, plus a head shake that turns the whole mouth into a saw. The bite doesn't have to be tremendously powerful, because the bite isn't the mechanism. The lateral shake is. That's a system for removing pieces from something enormous. A seal, a whale carcass, and the whole thing is optimized around cutting. Nothing in Mosasaurus points that way. No cutting-optimized dentition. No jaw suspension built for sawing. And critically, remember what we just established, a mouthful of backward hooks that only make sense if things are going down the throat rather than being reduced outside it. So the tooth is telling you the animal's whole strategy. It's built to go into something, set, and not let go. And around it is a skull built like a battering ram. Go back and look at that skull with this in mind. Deep, massive, thick-boned in the jaw and the snout. That heavy build we flagged earlier, the thing that made Mosasaurus the linebacker of its family, is not decoration. It's the frame that has to survive whatever the teeth land on, which raises the obvious question: how hard could it bite? And this is where I have to stop and be very careful with you, because you've heard numbers. Everybody's heard numbers. Bite force figures get thrown around online for Mosasaurus, with total confidence, huge tonnage values, presented like someone put a sensor in there. Here is what a bite force number for an extinct animal actually is. It's a model. Someone takes the skull, works out where the jaw muscles attached from the scars and hollows in the bone, estimates how big those muscles were, estimates their fiber arrangement, and how much force per unit area they could generate, calculates the leverage from the joint to the tooth position, and does the arithmetic. Every single one of those steps is an estimate. Muscle doesn't fossilize. You're reconstructing the size of something that has been gone for 70 million years from the shape of the hole it left. Change your assumption about muscle cross-section by 20% and your final number moves enormously. Change which living animal you're calibrating against. Crocodile. Monitor lizard. Inaum. And it moves again. The error bars on these things are not decorative. They're the whole picture. So when I tell you the modeling suggests a very high bite force, I want that understood correctly. It is a calculation wearing the costume of a measurement. It's a reasonable calculation. It's probably in the right neighborhood. But nobody measured this. Nobody can measure this. And anyone quoting you a precise figure to the kilogram is selling you something the fossils never said. What we can say with much more confidence is the shape of the answer, because shape survives where numbers don't. A deep skull with heavy bone and big muscle attachment areas and short, robust, thick-walled teeth is an animal optimized for high force at the bite point, rather than speed of closure. That's a puncture and crush profile. That much is architecture, and architecture doesn't need a model to be read. Now the survival logic. Why would you build that? Because of what was swimming around it. Picture the late Cretaceous seas, shallow, warm, flooding across continents. And in them, an enormous amount of the available food is wearing armor. Ammonites everywhere, in staggering numbers. Soft animals inside coiled shells. Sea turtles, some of them huge, with shells and heavy bone. Thick-scaled fish, nautiloids, bivalves the size of dinner plates. The Cretaceous ocean was a hard-shelled buffet, and most of the calories in it were locked behind a barrier. An animal with slicing teeth is useless against that. A blade needs something soft to pass through. Hit a shell with a serrated edge, and you get a scratch and a broken tooth. But puncture and crush? That's a key. That's a system that turns armor from a defense into an inconvenience. You don't have to open it elegantly. You have to break it once, hard, and then everything inside is available. That's what the overbuilt skull buys, not power for its own sake. Access. It's a can opener, and the ocean was full of cans. And notice what that does to the menu. A slicing predator is limited to prey. It can cut into swallowable portions. A crushing predator with a ratcheting throat is limited by one thing only: what fits. Anything armored but small enough to go down is now food. Anything soft and small enough to go down is food. The constraint moved from "can I cut this" to "can I swallow this?" That's a much wider menu. It's also a much more specific one, because it hard caps the top end. There's a size above which nothing is prey, no matter how hard you bite. And that ceiling is set by your own throat, which is a strange thing to say about an apex predator. The biggest thing in the sea, with a bite that could break a shell, and its diet was fundamentally governed by the width of a tube in its own neck. Now the cost, because there's always a cost. Go back to the bone. These animals had lightened their skeletons for buoyancy, that spongy internal structure we talked about. Now put a bite like this at the front of that body. Every time this animal clamps down on something rigid, that force runs back through the skull, into the jaw joint, into the neck, into a frame that has been deliberately compromised for flotation. Something in that arrangement is absorbing punishment, and in the teeth themselves you can see the receipts. Mosasaur teeth turn up broken, worn, chipped, tips gone, faces scarred. That's a system taking damage constantly, which is exactly why the continuous replacement conveyor exists underneath. The animal was budgeting for breakage. It expected to lose teeth regularly, enough that a permanent factory was worth the metabolic cost. You don't build that unless the violence is routine. So here's the profile we've assembled from anatomy alone. And I want to be clear that everything up to this point is inference. Reasonable, evidence-based, physics-constrained inference. But inference. We have taken a skull and a tooth and reasoned outward to a lifestyle. The prediction, a heavy-headed ambush predator that punctured, crushed, and swallowed prey whole. Something that specialized in armored, medium-sized animals. Something that hit hard and often, broke its own teeth doing it, and grew new ones. That's what the machine says it was for. And that's exactly the kind of confident, tidy reconstruction that reality loves to humiliate. Because we don't have to stop at inference here. This is one of the rare cases where we can actually check the answer, where the rock preserved not the tool, but the results. Fossils exist with the last meal still inside the body cavity. Bones exist with mosasaur tooth marks punched through them. The evidence is physical, it's specific, and it does not fully match the prediction. Some of what turns up in those stomachs shouldn't be there at all. And one of the things this animal was eating has a name that changes the entire tone of this story. There's a slab of rock. Inside it, a mosasaur. And inside the mosasaur, between its ribs, where the gut cavity used to be, other animals. Not a smear, not a chemical trace. Bones. Recognizable, identifiable bones of other creatures sitting exactly where they were when the animal died, with them undigested. This is the closest thing paleontology ever gets to a confession. Everything up to now has been reasoning. Reading a tooth, modeling a muscle, inferring a lifestyle from architecture. This is different. This is the last meal preserved, in the correct anatomical location. So what's in there? Fish. Lots of fish, which is the boring answer, and also the important one, because it tells you the daily bread of these animals was probably not spectacular. Turtles in some specimens, which is exactly what the crushing prediction wanted. Sharks, including in one famous case, a mosasaur that had swallowed a shark whole, which is a sentence worth sitting with, because sharks are not passive food. Seabirds have turned up in mosasaur gut contents. Those Cretaceous diving birds with teeth in their beaks were apparently on the menu, which means these things were taking prey at the surface, from below. The armored stuff checks out. The prediction holds. And then you get to a specimen with mosasaur bones inside a mosasaur. Sit with the geometry of that. The gut cavity of a large marine lizard, and the remains of another large marine lizard inside it. Not a scrap. Not a bone fragment that could have washed in. The species-level identification in the best documented cases points to the same kind of animal doing the eating. The apex predator's diet included itself. Now, I need to be scrupulous here, because this is where documentaries go wrong, and where the honest version gets more interesting, not less. Stomach contents prove consumption. They do not prove predation. A mosasaur with another mosasaur inside it could have killed it. Or it could have found a floating carcass and taken a piece. Carcasses were abundant out there, and nothing in that ecosystem was too proud to scavenge. Scavenging is free calories, and free calories are the best kind. From the fossil alone, in most cases, you cannot distinguish murder from opportunism. The bones look the same either way, so the honest claim is, mosasaurs ate mosasaurs. Whether they hunted each other or ate their dead, or both, is not settled by a stomach. Except there's a second line of evidence, and it isn't in a stomach, it's on faces. Mosasaur skulls turn up with damage, punctures, gouges, fractures in the snout and jaw, tooth marks in bone. And when you look at the spacing and the shape of those marks, they match mosasaur teeth. That's not a shark bite. It's not a random break from burial, something with cone teeth and a heavy jaw closed on this animal's head. And here's the part that changes everything. A lot of them are healed, bone that's been damaged and then grown over, remodeled, rounded off, which means the animal did not die from that injury. It took a bite to the face from another mosasaur, swam away, and lived long enough for the bone to knit. That's not scavenging. You can't scavenge something that heals. That's a fight, a real one, between two living animals that both survived, or at least that one of them survived, and we're only ever going to find the survivors because the losers don't produce healed scars. They just produce stomach contents. So the picture changes. This wasn't an animal cruising an empty ocean helping itself to fish. It was operating in water where the most dangerous thing it could encounter was another one of itself, and where getting your face opened was survivable often enough that we keep finding the receipts. Why would that be? Two obvious pressures, both inference, both plausible. Competition. A limited food supply and a lot of large predators, which means every meal is contested. And mating. Combat scars in living animals frequently come from fights over access to mates, and healed facial injuries are exactly the signature that produces. We can't tell which from the bone. Both may be true. What the bone says is the violence was frequent, close range, and aimed at the head. Now here's the twist that undercuts the whole apex fantasy. Look at the scale of what's actually being eaten. Fish, birds, turtles, sharks that are smaller than the mosasaur. Nothing in the gut contents suggests this animal was routinely taking down enormous prey, which is exactly what the throat predicted. Remember? The ceiling isn't set by the bite. It's set by the tube. So the terror of the Cretaceous seas was, in day-to-day terms, eating things you could carry in your arms, constantly. And that's not a downgrade. That's a treadmill. An animal this size, eating packages that size, has to eat a lot of them. Every single day. Forever. That's the horror. And it isn't cinematic at all. It's arithmetic. Now the ammonites. This is my favorite piece of evidence in the entire mosasaur story, and it might not be evidence at all. Ammonite shells turn up with holes in them. Rows of punctures, roughly circular, sometimes in a paired arrangement, going through the shell wall. And for decades the interpretation was obvious and beautiful. Mosasaur bite marks. The predator grabs the ammonite, the cone teeth punch through the shell, the animal inside is exposed. The spacing looked right. The size looked right. Some specimens showed multiple bite sets, as if the shell had been repositioned and bitten again. The animal working out how to open its lunch. It's a perfect story. It's in books. It's in museums. Then somebody proposed something much less romantic, limpets. Limpets are small mollusks that attach to hard surfaces, and over time, wear a shallow home scar into whatever they're sitting on. A spot matched precisely to their own shell margin, so they can clamp down and seal. Those scars are round. They come in clusters. They appear on shells. And when you compare them against the ammonite punctures, some of them line up disturbingly well. Under that reading, the famous mosasaur bite marks are the parking spots of tiny snails. The debate has been running for a long time, and it has not been cleanly resolved. Some punctures look genuinely bite-like, irregular, cracked, forced. Others look far too tidy, too evenly matched, too regularly spaced to be teeth in a struggle. The likely answer is that both phenomena exist, and that the older literature overassigned everything to mosasaurs, because mosasaurs made a better story. I'm leaving that open, because it's the cleanest demonstration of something you need to carry through the rest of this. A fossil is not information. A fossil is a physical object that someone has to interpret, and the interpretation is downstream of what we already believe. We believed in the monster, so the holes were bites. Same mistake as the frill in a different costume. So here's what the stomach actually gave us. Cleanly separated. Fact. Mosasaurs ate fish, turtles, sharks, seabirds, and other mosasaurs. Fact. They bit each other in the face repeatedly and survived it. Inference. They hunted actively, since a scavenger doesn't need a face like that. Unresolved. How much of the ammonite predation story is real? And now the problem that all of it creates, added up. Constant hunting because the prey is small and the animal is not. Regular high-force impacts on armored prey, breaking teeth. Fights with other mosasaurs, taking injuries that have to be repaired. Healing bone, growing new teeth. Moving a heavy body through dense water, all day, every day. That is an enormous energy bill. Relentless. It never stops arriving. And every reptile you have ever seen pays that kind of bill by not paying it, by being cold, by being slow, by sitting still for days, by letting the sun do the work. This animal couldn't. The evidence says it couldn't. So where was a lizard getting the energy to run a life like this? The answer is in the chemistry of its teeth, and it means the word reptile has been lying to you this entire time. Cold water, real cold, the kind that pulls the heat out of a body in minutes. Every reptile you know has a rule about that water. Don't. A crocodile in cold water shuts down. A lizard in cold water stops being an animal and becomes an object. Take a sea turtle into water that's too cold and it goes into cold stunning, floating, immobile, waiting to die. That's not weakness. That's the whole reptile bargain. You don't pay for heat, so you don't get to choose where you live. Now here's what the evidence says about Mosasaurus. It went in anyway. Not just tolerated it, operated in it. Mosasaur fossils turn up at high latitudes, in deposits from cold Cretaceous water, polar regions, the far north, the far south, places where a normal reptile has no business being at all. And that is the crack in the whole story, because that should not be possible for a lizard. Something was generating heat inside that body. Start with what it buys, because the advantage is enormous, and the movies don't have any concept of it. If you can run warm, you own the cold water. Every cold-blooded competitor in that ocean is locked out of it. The sharks, the fish, the other reptiles, the high latitudes, the deeper layers below the sun-warmed surface, the night. All of that becomes yours exclusively, because nothing else can follow you in and function. And even where the water is warm, being warm yourself changes what your body can do. Warm muscle contracts faster, warm nerves fire faster. Warm digestion processes food faster, which means you can eat again sooner. Sustained pursuit becomes possible. A cold animal can lunge once, spectacularly, and then it's done. It's in oxygen debt. It needs hours. A warm animal can lunge and then keep going. Now take that and look back at what we built 2 chapters ago. Constant hunting, small prey, eaten frequently, fights with its own species, regenerating teeth, healing bone. That entire lifestyle only works if the animal has an engine. And a cold-blooded animal simply cannot pay for it. So the treadmill and the furnace are the same fact. The reason it had to eat constantly is the reason it could hunt constantly, okay? How do we know? Here's where it gets clever, and here's where I have to walk you through the reasoning. Because you should be able to see the joints in it. Teeth are made of enamel. Enamel forms inside the animal's own body, laid down from body fluids, at body temperature. And it contains oxygen atoms, locked in, permanently, chemically stable, unchanged for 70 million years if the fossil hasn't been chemically wrecked. Oxygen comes in different weights. Most of it is the light version. A small fraction is heavier, and the ratio between them that gets locked into a growing tooth depends on 2 things: the composition of the water the animal is drinking and living in, and the temperature at which the mineral formed, which means the tooth is a thermometer. It recorded chemically the temperature of the body that grew it. Now the actual experiment. Take mosasaur teeth from a range of localities. Some from warm, shallow seas, some from colder, higher latitude water. Take fish teeth from the same deposits, because fish are cold-blooded, and their body temperature just tracks the water. The fish are your control. They tell you what the ocean was doing. Then compare. If mosasaurs were ordinary reptiles, their isotope signature should track the fish exactly. Warm sea, warm animal. Cold sea, cold animal. Same slope, same line. They don't track. Mosasaur teeth from cold water localities record body temperatures elevated well above the surrounding water. and the animals stay relatively stable across environments where the fish swing wildly. The body wasn't following the ocean. It was holding its own line. Same study design has been run across marine reptiles, and it doesn't give everyone the same answer, which is exactly what makes it credible rather than convenient. Ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs come out looking strongly warm. Mosasaurs come out warm, but the results have been read as somewhat less regulated than the other two. Turtles from the same work look intermediate. It's not one blanket answer applied to everything reptilian and prehistoric. It's a spread, and different animals land in different places on it. Now the caveats, and they're real. This is inference from geochemistry, not a measurement. You're assuming the isotopic composition of Cretaceous seawater at that spot. You're assuming the enamel hasn't been chemically altered during 70 million years underground. You're assuming your fish control is actually recording the same water at the same time. Every one of those is defensible, and every one is an assumption. And the results shift depending on how you handle them. And warm-blooded is the wrong phrase, which is why I keep avoiding it. It's not a switch. It's a spectrum with a lot of positions on it. And the honest term for what mosasaurs were doing is somewhere in that middle territory. Elevated, regulated to a degree, but not necessarily mammal grade. There's a version that needs no revolution at all. Gigantothermy. Get big enough, and you retain heat simply because volume grows faster than surface area. A large body loses heat slowly, for the same reason a large pot of water takes longer to cool than a cup. A 10-meter animal could run warm on physics alone, without a special metabolism. Except gigantothermy has a hole in it, and the hole is the babies. A small animal can't do it. Surface to volume is against them completely. So if size alone explains the heat, then juvenile mosasaurs were cold, and juvenile mosasaurs were living in the same water as the adults. Bone growth structure in mosasaurs also points toward fast, sustained growth rates, the kind that demand real metabolic investment rather than passive heat retention. The most likely answer is both. Some genuine internal heat production, amplified by size, in an animal that was never going to be a crocodile no matter how you squint at it. And now the trap. Because everything I just described as an advantage is a bill. Heat is not free. Heat is combusted food. A warm body is a fire, and a fire has to be fed continuously or it goes out. And unlike a cold animal, it cannot simply be turned off and left in a corner for 3 weeks. A crocodile can eat once and coast for a month. That's not a limitation. That's the single greatest survival feature in the reptile toolkit. And it's why crocodiles have survived every mass extinction thrown at them. When food disappears, a cold animal just waits. It becomes a rock. It costs nothing. Mosasaurus deleted that option. Warm body, big body, top of the food chain, constant fuel demand, no ability to power down. Every day of its life, it had to find enough calories or start dying. For 30 million years, that was a brilliant trade. There was plenty of food. Remember this. When we get to the end of this story, this exact feature is going to be the thing that kills the entire group. And the animals that survive are going to be the ones that could shut off. But we're not there yet because the furnace creates a more immediate problem. And it's the one nobody thinks about. This animal is a lizard. Lizards lay eggs. Eggs go in dirt, on land, in a nest, above water. That's the arrangement. That's how squamates have always done it. And this one's limbs are gone. There's no crawling up a beach. There's no digging. It's a torpedo with paddles and a fluke, and no ability to support its own weight out of water, living in open ocean, sometimes at polar latitudes. So where does it lay an egg? The answer, when they found it, had been sitting in museum drawers for decades, misidentified as something that flies. There's a bone in a museum drawer. Small, delicate, thin-walled, light. The kind of thing you handle carefully because it looks like it would snap under a thumb. Somebody labeled it as a bird, a Cretaceous seabird. That made sense. The deposits are full of them, and the bone is exactly the right size and exactly the right build. Light, hollow-looking, fragile. Textbook bird. It sat there. For decades, it is not a bird. It's a newborn Mosasaurus. I want you to feel the size of that mistake because it isn't a filing error. It's a category error about what a baby of the biggest predator in the ocean even looked like. We had the animal, we had it in a drawer. Nobody recognized it because nobody expected a mosasaur that small, and nobody expected one there. Start with the problem, because the problem is genuinely severe. This animal is a lizard. Squamates lay eggs. That's the deal. You dig a hole, you put eggs in it, you leave. An egg is a sealed chamber that needs to exchange oxygen through its shell with air. Put a reptile egg underwater, and the embryo drowns. There's no version of that arrangement that works in the sea. So every marine reptile that keeps eggs has to keep the beach. Look at a sea turtle. 100 million years of ocean life, fully marine, and it still cannot escape the sand. Every generation, the females have to come back, haul a body evolved for water up a slope it can barely move on, dig, lay, and drag themselves back. It's the most vulnerable thing they ever do. It's why turtle nesting beaches are a slaughter, and the ocean can't fix it, because eggs need air. Now look at Mosasaurus. The limbs are gone. Not reduced, restructured. Blocky wrist mush, hyperphalange, a paddle. There is no elbow that will lift a body, no foot that will grip sand, no chance of hauling 12 meters of animal out of the water and digging. And the ribs and lungs are built for water pressure, supporting the body from all sides. Beached, its own weight would work against it. It cannot go ashore. It literally cannot. That door closed millions of years earlier, back at the Aegialosaur stage, and the group never looked back. So it's a lizard that must lay eggs in an ocean with no way to reach land. That's not a difficulty. That's an impossibility. For a long time, the assumed answer was coastal nurseries. They must have come into shallow water, sheltered bays, protected lagoons, somewhere calm, and given birth there, live in the shallows. It was a compromise everyone could live with. The animals stay marine, the babies get protection, and the whole thing looks a bit like how some sharks do it. The evidence for that? Not much. Mostly the assumption that small, vulnerable animals must have somewhere safe to be. Then those bird bones got looked at again. Here's what they actually are. Jaws, vertebrae, and skeletal elements of mosasaurs, so young they were newborns, or close to it. Tiny. The species identification points to real mosasaurs, not some separate small genus. And the mosasaur signature is unmistakable once you're looking for it. Teeth, jaw architecture, all of it. Just miniaturized. That settles live birth. There's no other way for an animal that cannot reach land to produce these. Mosasaurs were viviparous. They gave birth to live young, in the water, fully formed, and swimming. And there are mosasaur specimens preserved with embryos, or young, inside the body cavity, which nails it independently. Which is already strange enough. Live birth is a mammal-coded trait in most people's heads, and here it is in a lizard the size of a boat. Although, and this is the part that reframes it, it shouldn't shock us at all. Squamates do this constantly. Live birth has evolved in lizards and snakes over 100 separate times. Vipers do it. Boas do it. Skinks do it. It's one of the most repeatedly reinvented tricks in the entire group. So the mosasaurs didn't invent anything. They inherited a lineage that was already extremely good at deleting the egg, and they took it to the only place where deleting the egg was the difference between existing and not. But the newborn bones did something else. And this is the part that matters. They came out of the wrong rock, not from ancient shallow bays, not from lagoon deposits, from sediments that formed in open ocean. Deep water, far from any coast, the kind of rock that accumulates in the middle of nowhere, the chalk equivalent of the abyss. The babies were out there, in the blue, where there is no bottom, no shelter, no structure, no shallow, nothing. And that kills the nursery hypothesis. There's no evidence for a protected coastal creche because the newborns weren't in protected coastal water. They were born in open ocean, exactly where the adults were hunting. Now run the trade because it's brutal and it's clean. What live birth buys? No beach, ever. No haul out, no nest, no eggs sitting in sand waiting for something to dig them up, no hatchlings sprinting for the surf. The single most dangerous phase of a sea turtle's entire life cycle. Deleted. The mother is never vulnerable. She is never out of her element. She never stops being a predator. Not for 1 hour. What live birth costs, the baby arrives in open water. There is no shelter in open water. That's not a metaphor. In the middle of the ocean, there is nothing. No reef, no rock, no weed, no bottom, nothing to get behind. A newborn mosasaur enters the world in a transparent, three-dimensional space where it can be seen from every angle simultaneously, and there is nowhere to go. It has to swim immediately. It has to breathe immediately. It's an air breather, born underwater, and its first act in existence is to reach a surface it has never seen. It has to feed itself because there's no evidence for parental care, and I'm not going to invent any. None. The fossils show babies in open ocean deposits. They don't show a mother staying. So, no shelter, no bottom, no teaching, no protection. And look what's swimming around it. We established this 2 chapters ago. Mosasaurs eat mosasaurs. Sharks are there. Bigger mosasaurs are there. The newborn isn't just exposed to a hostile ocean. It's born into an ecosystem where the most abundant large predator around is its own species, and its own species is documented as cannibalistic. That baby's greatest threat is probably its own kind. There's a slightly softer read worth flagging, since I promised honesty over drama. Those counter-shaded flanks, the tiny non-reflective scales, a newborn has that too. It's born camouflaged. Every disappearing trick the adults use it has from minute 1. That's not nothing. It's not care, but it's equipment, and that's the whole reproductive strategy laid out. No nurture, no beach, no safety. Just an animal that arrives fully assembled and immediately begins the same arithmetic its parents were doing. Find food, don't be food, keep the furnace lit. Compare that to what's on screen. The film Mosasaur has no life cycle at all. It doesn't come from anywhere. It doesn't reproduce. It has no infancy, no vulnerability, no relationship to any other individual of its species. It's a prop that exists in a tank so the audience can look at it. The real one had a hard, unforgiving, completely unsentimental life cycle that started at maximum exposure and never really got easier. So the life cycle closes, birth to death, all of it in water, none of it touching land. But the bones aren't finished talking because a skeleton doesn't only record what an animal was. Cut one open and it records what happened to it. And mosasaur vertebrae, when you section them, are full of damage. Not bites, not fractures, something worse and stranger, and coming from inside the bone itself. The animal was doing something to itself, repeatedly, and it never healed. Cut a mosasaur vertebra in half and polish the face. You expect structure, ordered bone, the internal architecture of a load-bearing element, the light, spongy latticework we talked about, a design. even if it's a compromised one. In a lot of these, that's not what's there. There are holes, craters in the internal bone, pits with collapsed edges, regions where the tissue has caved in on itself and then been sloppily rebuilt around the wreckage. The surface can be dimpled. The head of the vertebra, where it should be smooth and round, can look partially chewed from the inside. Nothing bit this. There's no puncture, no entry wound, no tooth mark anywhere. The damage starts inside the bone and works outward. The bone died, while the animal was alive. The condition is a vascular necrosis, and it means exactly what it sounds like. Bone is living tissue and it needs blood. Interrupt the supply to a region, and the cells in it starve and die. The dead patch doesn't hold load anymore, so it collapses under the animal's own weight, and the body, because bodies do this, tries to repair the collapse by laying new bone over the ruin. The result is a permanent scar in the skeleton, or in fossilized damage in a fossilized animal. Now the question that matters: what cuts the blood supply to the inside of a vertebra in a swimming animal? In living animals, one of the classic answers is decompression, gas. Here's the mechanism, and it's the same one that hurts human divers. Go deep, and the pressure around you rises fast. Every 10 meters of water adds roughly another atmosphere. Under that pressure, nitrogen from the lungs dissolves into the blood and tissues in greater quantities than it would at the surface. It's not doing damage down there. It's just in solution, quietly. Come up slowly, and it comes back out slowly. Fine. Come up fast, and the pressure drops faster than the gas can leave through the lungs. And it comes out of solution where it is, in the blood, in the tissue, as bubbles. A bubble in a blood vessel is a plug, and the blood vessels feeding the interior of a bone are narrow and their end runs. They don't have alternate routes around a blockage. So a bubble parks in one, and the tissue downstream of it gets nothing. It starves. It dies. And the animal probably doesn't even notice at the time, because there's no pain receptor reporting from the middle of a vertebra. The damage arrives silently, and it's permanent. Bone doesn't get a second chance at that. This is a real documented pathology in living marine animals. It's been described in whales and in sea turtles, and it turns up in mosasaurs. So we can say something remarkable. This animal dove. Not once. Repeatedly over years, deep enough and often enough to accumulate permanent injuries in its own spine. We didn't infer that from a shape. That's not a modeled bite force or an estimated body length. That's a physical injury with a known physical cause, sitting in the bone. Now, the honesty flag, and this one's important because it's exactly where popular retellings overreach. The lesions are a signature, not a depth gauge. They tell you decompression stress happened. They do not tell you how deep. They don't tell you how often or how long the animal stayed down or what its dive profile looked like. There is no calculation that turns a necrotic patch into a number in meters, and anyone who gives you one is inventing it. They also don't tell you why. A dive injury can come from hunting deep. It can come from fleeing something and surfacing too fast in a panic. Both leave the same scar. The bone records the physics, not the motive. And there's a live argument about the cause itself. Some researchers have questioned whether all mosasaur bone lesions are decompression-related at all. Whether some could come from infection, injury, or other pathology entirely. The decompression reading is well supported and widely held. It isn't unanimous. What's not in doubt is the frequency. These lesions are not rare. They're not a handful of unlucky individuals. Survey enough mosasaur vertebrae, and the damage turns up across specimens, across localities, across genera. A substantial fraction of the animals examined carrying it. Not exceptional. Normal. In some samples, most of them. which is the actual finding. It's not a mosasaur once had a bad dive. It's that this was a routine occupational injury for the entire group. Now sit with what that means, because it's brutal in a way that isn't dramatic at all. If the damage is that common, the diving was constant. And if the diving was constant, despite causing permanent, cumulative, irreversible damage to the animal's own load-bearing skeleton, the very structure it needs to drive that fluke, then whatever was down there was worth it. Evolution does not tolerate expensive habits that don't pay. If a behavior maims you and the lineage keeps doing it for 30 million years, the return has to exceed the cost, every time, at scale. So there was food down there, below the sunlit water, deeper than an animal's body wants to go. Enough of it, reliably enough, that a group of air-breathing lizards would pay for it in their spines and keep coming back. And here's the wound in the wound. Go back to what we said about the skeleton. These animals had lightened their bone for buoyancy, traded density for flotation, gone spongy inside. And that spongy interior is exactly the tissue that decompression damage destroys. The buoyancy solution and the vulnerability are the same feature. Fix the flotation problem. Inherit the necrosis problem. Nothing is free, not once, in this entire animal. Now put it against the animal on screen one last time. The film version has no history. It's undamaged. It's a smooth, perfect, unmarked object because props don't accumulate. Nothing has happened to it. It has no past. The real one is covered in receipts, healed tooth marks on its face from fights with its own species, broken and replaced teeth from biting things that were harder than teeth, and a spine full of dead bone from going deeper than its own body could safely handle, over and over. For a paycheck it was apparently unable to refuse. That's what an actual life looks like when you dig it up. It's a logbook. Every entry is damage, and the animal that survives that long enough to fossilize is the one that was winning, which leaves a hole in the story, and it's the biggest one yet. Go down there with it, past the surface light, into water where the blue drains out and everything turns gray and then goes. Cold, dim, enormous. And now ask the question nobody asks about this animal. How did it find anything? It's not a shark. It has no electrical sense we can find. It's not a whale. There's no echolocation. It's a lizard. Its whole sensory toolkit came from an animal that hunted on hot rocks in bright sun. So what exactly was it hunting with? Get inside the skull and look out. Not at it. Out of it. Put your eye where its eye was and ask what the world actually looked like from in there. Because we've spent 12 chapters building a hunting machine and we have not once asked how it found anything to hunt. The default assumption is that it had a full sensory suite. Big predator, big ocean. Must have had the equipment. Electroreception like a shark. Distance chemistry like a shark. Whale-grade hearing. Something. Apex predators in fiction are always omniscient. They sense you coming. That's the trope. Strip that out. All of it. Here's what the evidence actually supports. No electroreception. Sharks have ampullae of Lorenzini, a network of jelly-filled canals that detect the faint electrical fields generated by muscle activity in other animals. It lets a shark find a flatfish buried in sand in total darkness. It's one of the most powerful hunting senses in the ocean. Mosasaurs are lizards. No squamate has anything like that system, and there's no skeletal evidence for one in any mosasaur skull. The canal network would leave traces in bone, and it doesn't. So the shark's superpower is off the table. No echolocation. That's a whale invention, requiring specialized soft tissue, a modified nasal apparatus, and a jaw structure for receiving returns. Mosasaur skulls don't have the architecture. Nobody's arguing they do, so the two great deep-water hunting technologies, bioelectric detection and biological sonar, are both absent. It had neither. What did it have? Eyes, mostly. And the eyes are informative. Mosasaur orbits are big, substantial eye sockets in a substantial skull, and inside them, in well-preserved specimens, a sclerotic ring, a circle of small bony plates that sits inside the eyeball itself, bracing it. Lizards have these. Birds have these. And because the ring surrounds the aperture, its dimensions carry information about the eye's optics. Big eye, big aperture. More light gathered. That's a low-light instrument. It's the signature of an animal working in dim conditions. Deep water, dusk, night, or all three. The bracing has a second job too. Push a soft eyeball through water at speed, and the pressure of the flow tries to deform it. Deform the eye, and the image goes. A bony ring holds the shape against that load. So the eye is also built to keep working while the animal moves fast. Now the limitation, and it's a hard one, the orbits sit fairly high and lateral on that skull, set toward the sides, which means the visual fields don't overlap much in front. Poor binocular vision, poor stereo depth perception. That's a real problem. Judging the closing distance to a moving target with two independent, mostly non-overlapping views is genuinely difficult. Some mosasaur genera did better than others. There's variation across the group, and some forms had more forward-facing orbits than Mosasaurus did, but the heavy-headed ones weren't optimized for precision ranging. Hearing next, and this is where the reconstruction gets thin. Squamates have a single middle ear bone, the stapes. And in mosasaurs, it's a stout, heavy little element. Some researchers have argued the mosasaur ear was reasonably capable underwater, that the structure suggests real function rather than a vestige. But here's the honest position. Underwater hearing is largely a soft tissue problem. It depends on how sound gets from the water into the ear, what tissues conduct it, how the whole apparatus is coupled and damped. None of that fossilizes. We have one bone and a hole in the skull, and from that, we're reconstructing an entire sensory channel. This is among the softest inference in the whole video, and I'm flagging it as such. Smell is worse. The nostrils on a mosasaur have retracted, moved back along the snout, away from the tip, towards the eyes. That's a breathing adaptation. It lets the animal take air with minimal exposure at the surface, barely breaking the water. Practical, sensible. It also means the nasal passage geometry has been rearranged around breathing rather than around chemistry. In some marine reptiles, the olfactory apparatus appears reduced when that happens. The trade being made explicitly, and then there's the tongue. Remember it from way back? The flicking monitor lizard tongue that collects chemical traces and delivers them to a sensory organ in the palate. That's the squamate chemistry system, and it's a good one, and mosasaurs may have inherited it. We don't know. Tongues are muscle. There's no fossilized mosasaur tongue. The Jacobson's organ sits in soft tissue in the roof of the mouth, which in mosasaurs is real estate now occupied by 2 rows of teeth. Did the palate teeth crowd out the chemical sense? Did the animal still flick? Was it tasting the water column ahead of it? Or had it abandoned the whole apparatus? Genuinely unknown. That hole in the record is not going to close. So here's the honest sensory profile. Good low-light vision, badly ranged. Uncertain hearing. Compromised or unknown chemistry. No electrical sense, no sonar. That is a narrow world. And now the twist. Because this is the part that reframes the entire animal. The frightening thing about Mosasaurus is not what it could sense. It's what it couldn't. Run the logic. If your senses are limited, if you can't detect prey at long range, if you can't ping it, can't smell it out reliably, can't feel its muscles firing through the water, then you cannot pursue. Pursuit requires knowing where something is before you commit. You can't chase what you can't track. What you can do is wait. Ambush isn't a tactic this animal chose. It's a tactic the sensory limits forced on it. It had to get close before detecting anything, which means it had to already be close, which means it had to be somewhere prey would come to it, and it had to be invisible while it waited. And now everything we've built snaps into one machine. Big low-light eyes. Sit below in the dim water and look up. Prey at shallower depth is silhouetted against the surface glare, the one lighting geometry where an animal is unmissable. You don't need distant sense. You need the target to place itself against a bright background, counter-shading. While you're looking up, they're looking down at nothing. Pale belly against bright surface, invisible from below. The camouflage direction and the hunting direction are the same direction. That's not a coincidence. That's a system. Tiny keeled scales. No flash off the flank. No signature while you hold position. The fluke, when you commit once. Thrust concentrated at the back. A stiff body. One hard acceleration through a short gap. You don't get a second attempt. A missed ambush is a lost meal, and the sensory limits mean you can't convert it into a chase. Poor binocular vision. And it doesn't matter. At zero distance, with a mouth over a meter long, you don't need to range precisely. You need to be roughly right and enormously wide. The palate teeth. The moment contact happens, the ratchet takes over. The mouth doesn't need to be accurate. It needs to be one way. The warm blood, cold water, dim depths, night, all available to you. None available to your competitors. And the engine to convert a single explosive strike into a life. The dive injuries. You went down there, repeatedly, into water where the light fails. Hunting on the geometry of looking up at what little there is. Every single feature we've established across 12 chapters is answering the same problem. How do you eat when you can't find anything at a distance? Answer: don't find it. Let it come. Delete yourself. Look up. Wait. That's the corrected animal. And here's why it's worse than the fiction, in the precise sense the title promised. The screen Mosasaur is a bag of unconnected scary features. Huge, armored, spiked, loud, always aware, always coming. Nothing on it relates to anything else on it. It's a collection of choices made by people trying to frighten an audience. The real one is coherent. Every part explains every other part. The skin explains the hunt. The hunt explains the eyes. The eyes explain the ambush. The ambush explains the fluke. The fluke explains the teeth. The teeth explain the throat. The throat explains the diet. The diet explains the metabolism. The metabolism explains the dives. The dives explain the damage. Pull one piece, and the others stop making sense. That's what a real organism looks like. It's a solution, and every part of it is load-bearing. And that's the actual horror. Not a monster. A machine with no wasted parts, sitting in dim water below you that cannot see you very well and does not need to. But I've been telling this story wrong. I've been talking about an animal, singular. The one skull, the one predator, the one solution. It wasn't one animal. That machine got built in dozens of variants, at every size, in every ocean on the planet, in a span of time so short it barely registers in rock. Pull the camera back until the whole planet is in frame. Late Cretaceous. It doesn't look like your globe. Sea levels are extraordinarily high, some of the highest in the history of complex life. And the water has come up over the continents themselves. North America is cut in half by a seaway, running from the Arctic to the Gulf. Europe is an archipelago, a scatter of islands in warm, shallow water. Shallow seas are flooding across Africa, across South America, across the middle of continents that today are dry land 1,000 kilometers from a coast. The planet has grown an enormous amount of new shallow ocean, warm, productive, sunlit, packed with fish and ammonites and turtles. Now light it up. Every place a mosasaur fossil has been found. Put a dot on it. North America, Both sides, Europe, Africa, South America, the Middle East, Asia, New Zealand, Antarctica, the Arctic. The dots cover the map, all of it. Every ocean basin on the planet, pole to pole. That is not one animal. That's an occupation. Here's the misconception I've been letting you carry, and it's time to break it. Mosasaurus was not the mosasaur. It wasn't the monster, alone, ruling an empty sea. It was one member of a group that had already taken everything. Dozens of genera. An enormous spread of forms, and it arrived at the party late. Look at the variety, and the story stops being about a predator and starts being about an epidemic. There are small ones, genuinely small. Mosasaurs, a couple of meters long, working shallow water, eating small things. Not juveniles, adults. A whole branch of the family stayed compact. There are the crushers. Globidens is the one to know, a mosasaur that abandoned cones entirely and grew teeth like rounded knobs, blunt hemispheres set in a heavy jaw. That's not a stabbing tooth, that's a hammer. Globidens was breaking shellfish, bivalves, hard-shelled mollusks, pulverizing armor and eating what was inside. Put its skull next to Mosasaurus, and you would not guess they were relatives. There are the javelins, long, narrow-snouted forms with slim teeth, built for snapping at fast fish in open water. Different tooth, different skull, different prey, different world. There's Tylosaurus, with a reinforced solid snout projecting past the tooth row, a battering ram on the front of the face, which suggests ramming prey. That's inference, but it's the kind of inference that's hard to avoid when an animal grows a spike of bone at the front of its head and nothing else in the group has one. And there's Mosasaurus itself, heavy-headed, robust, thick-toothed, the generalist bruiser. Same body plan, same fluke, same paddles, same palate teeth. Radically different heads because the head is where the job lives, and every one of them had a different job. That's irradiation. One design exploded outward into every available role, everywhere, simultaneously. Now the number that should genuinely unsettle you. Mosasaurs appear roughly 90-something million years ago as recognizably marine animals. The Cretaceous ends 66 million years ago. Call it under 30 million years, from shoreline lizards to total global dominance of the oceans across every basin, in dozens of forms. 30 million years sounds enormous. It isn't. Ichthyosaurs took vastly longer to do less. Whales have had roughly 50 million years in the water and haven't produced anything like this spread of body plans. 30 million years is a geological blink, and mosasaurs used it to go from things that could still crawl on a beach to the apex predators of a planet. How? 3 things, and they stack. First, the timing. The mid-Cretaceous ocean had just lost its previous management. Ichthyosaurs, after over 100 million years of success, declined and vanished. Plesiosaurs were still around and doing fine, but the big fast pursuit predator role had opened up. There was a vacancy, and it was the best one in the sea. Second, the real estate. All those flooded continents, enormous shallow seas appearing across the planet, warm and productive and, critically for a lizard, connected to shorelines. Mosasaurs came from the coast. The ocean rising over the land brought their ocean to them and then kept extending it. They didn't have to cross the abyss to colonize the world. The world flooded, and they followed the water inland. Third, and this is where everything we built comes due, the engine, warm blood, or something close enough, fast growth, high metabolism. That combination doesn't just let an individual hunt in cold water, it lets a lineage evolve fast. Short generations, quick maturity, high energy throughput. When there's an empty niche in front of a group like that, The group fills it at a speed that looks unreasonable in rock. Vacant niches plus new habitat plus a fast-running body plan equals total occupation. And notice the order. Remember what we found in the tale? That the fluke architecture shows up more broadly and earlier across the group than the old story allowed? That matters here. They didn't spend 30 million years slowly learning to swim and then take the ocean at the end. They solved propulsion early and then spread. The conquest wasn't the last chapter of their evolution. It was the first thing they did. Which brings us to the thing nobody expects about Mosasaurus specifically. It's a latecomer. Mosasaurus is a Maastrichtian animal, the very last stage of the Cretaceous. Tylosaurus and its contemporaries had been running the seas for millions of years before Mosasaurus was a going concern. The genus that gives the whole group its name, that broke the concept of extinction, that ended up in the movie, appears near the end and is only around for the final act. And it did not have the ocean to itself. Other large mosasaurs were operating in the same water at the same time. Multiple big genera, overlapping, competing, which is the ugly little answer to something we found back in the stomach contents, all those healed bite marks on mosasaur faces, all that documented mosasaur on mosasaur violence. This is the ecosystem that produced it, not a lone apex predator with nothing to fear. A crowded ocean, dense with large, warm-running competitors with the same equipment and the same appetite. All of them needing to eat constantly, and none of them able to stop. Now the honest uncertainty, and it's the one that sets up everything that comes next. There's an argument about what mosasaurs were doing right at the end. Some analyses read declining diversity in the last stretch of the Cretaceous, the group thinning out, running out of steam. Others read that as an artifact of the rock record. Sea levels were falling at the close of the Cretaceous, which means less shallow marine sediment being deposited, which means fewer places for a mosasaur to become a fossil. Under that reading, the decline isn't in the animals, it's in the preservation. The debate is live, and I'm not going to resolve it for you. But the recent work has been trending in an uncomfortable direction. New mosasaur species keep getting described from the very last stage of the Cretaceous. New genera, new forms, which points at a group that was still generating novelty right up to the boundary, not dying, innovating. So here's where we stand. A lineage of shoreline lizards took every ocean on Earth in a geological instant, filled every predatory role, spread to both poles, produced hammer-toothed shell crushers and ram-snouted specialists and heavy-headed generalists, and was apparently still inventing new versions of itself in its final million years. Complete success, total occupation, no competitor left standing, and then all of it. Every genus, every form, every ocean, pole to pole, stops. Not thins out, stops. Every mosasaur on the planet gone, in a slice of rock so thin you could cover it with your hand. The most successful marine predators on Earth were erased, while animals that were smaller, slower, dumber, and less impressive in every measurable way walked straight through it. And the reason is the engine we've been admiring for the last 5 chapters. Find the boundary in a cliff face and put your finger on it. It's a line, not a metaphor. An actual physical layer in the rock, a band of clay you can trace with a fingertip. And it's the same band on every continent. Below it, mosasaur bones, ammonite shells, a functioning Cretaceous ocean. Above it, none of that. Ever again. The line is a few centimeters thick. Everything in this video dies inside that gap. Here's the assumption everyone brings to it. The asteroid killed the strong. Big things died, small things lived. Because the impact was so violent, it flattened whatever was largest. Dinosaurs went down because they were dinosaurs. Mosasaurs went down because they were monsters, and the monsters lost. That's backwards. The impact didn't target size. It targeted a specific way of making a living. And mosasaurs had spent 30 million years perfecting it. Run the actual mechanism because it's not fire and it's not blast. The impact throws an enormous quantity of pulverized rock and sulfur-rich material into the atmosphere. Not for a moment. The fine fraction stays up. Sunlight drops globally, hard. And in the ocean, sunlight isn't ambiance. It's the base of everything. The entire marine food web sits on phytoplankton, microscopic organisms in the surface water doing photosynthesis. They are the input. Every calorie in that ocean, from a copepod to a mosasaur, is solar energy that a plankton cell captured and passed up. Cut the light and the plankton don't shrink. They stop. Now watch it move. The plankton stop, and within a very short time, the zooplankton that eat them starve. Then the small fish. Then the bigger fish. The ocean doesn't die from the top down. It dies from the bottom up, and it does it fast, because none of those layers holds much of a reserve. The rock records this. The signature at the boundary in marine sediments shows a catastrophic collapse of surface productivity, a period where the biological pump essentially shut down, sometimes called the Strangelove Ocean. The water is still there. The chemistry is still there. The engine at the base of it is simply off. And now go and look at what Mosasaurus is. Chapter 10. A furnace. Warm body, elevated metabolism, heat that has to be paid for in food every single day with no ability to shut down. Chapter 9. A treadmill. Prey capped by the width of its own throat, which means small packages, which means constant eating. Chapter 14. The top of everything. Apex position, which means every calorie it consumed had passed through 4 or 5 other animals first, and each of those transfers threw away most of the energy. Chapter 3. A big body, which means the absolute quantity needed is enormous. Stack them. That animal needs the base of the food web running at full output continuously, forever. It has no reserve mode. It has no off switch. Every trait we've spent this entire video admiring is a bill, and the bill arrives every day. For 30 million years, that was the best trait on the planet. Plankton were producing. Fish were abundant. The furnace paid for itself 1,000 times over. It bought the cold water, the deep dives, the sustained hunting, the fast evolution, the global takeover. Then the light went out, and every single one of those advantages inverted at once. The high metabolism that let it hunt anything became a demand it couldn't reduce. The apex position that put it above all competition put it at the end of the longest, most fragile energy chain in the ocean. The first thing to break when the base fails. The big body that made it untouchable made its requirement enormous. The warm blood that let it go where nothing else could meant it could not do the one thing that would have saved it. It could not wait. Now look at who walked through crocodilians. Sitting in shallow water, cold-blooded, slow, capable of eating once and doing nothing for weeks. Turtles, small fish, scavengers, detritus feeders, things living off dead material rather than fresh production. Things that were small, cheap to run, low on the chain, and able to power down. The survivors were the unimpressive. That's the pattern. And it's not sentimental. It's arithmetic. When the energy stops, the only thing that matters is how little you need. Every extinction filter of that kind selects for cheapness, and Mosasaurus was the most expensive animal in the sea. The traits didn't fail. Failure isn't the right word. They were loans. 30 million years of borrowing against a productive ocean, and the ocean called it in over a period we can't even resolve properly in rock. Remember the argument from last chapter. Whether mosasaurs were already declining, I said I wouldn't resolve it and I won't. But the recent trend matters here, because new mosasaur species keep being described from the final stage of the Cretaceous. New genera, new forms, right up against the line. That's not a group running out of ideas, which means the most likely version is the worst one. They weren't fading, they were thriving. They were still inventing new versions of themselves in their last million years, still expanding, still doing everything right. And it made no difference at all. The last mosasaurs died in water that looked completely normal. That's what gets me. No visible catastrophe in the sea itself. No boiling, no fire. Nothing you could point at. Just water. Slightly dimmer. The same ocean it had always hunted in, with the same geometry, the same surface glare overhead. It went on hunting. It went on looking up for silhouettes, and there were fewer of them, and then fewer, and there was no moment where the animal could have known anything was wrong. It starved in a familiar ocean. Every part of that machine still worked. The fluke still drove. The pallet teeth still ratcheted. The counter shading still deleted it from view. The furnace still burned. Right up until there was nothing left to burn, so go back to the skull. It's still there. Still on a table in Paris, the block of Maastricht chalk, with a jaw coming out of it. The thing that came out of a quarry ceiling by lamplight before anyone on Earth had a word for what it was. Empty orbits. Backward-pointing teeth. A second row on the pallet, still aimed at a throat that isn't there. 240 years of people looking at that object and getting it wrong in good faith. A crocodile? A whale? An eel with flippers? A dragon with a frill down its back? A stadium-sized monster in a tank? Every one of those was somebody's honest best answer from the evidence they had, and every one of them got demolished by the next piece of rock that came out of the ground. And here's the part that should actually keep you up. Everything I just told you is provisional. The size is a range built by scaling a head onto a body we don't have. The bite force is a calculation wearing the costume of a measurement. The color is tone without pattern. The fluke shape is inferred from cousins. The dives have no depth. The tongue is a hole in the record we may never fill. Half of what I said is going to be corrected, and I can't tell you which half. That's not a weakness in the story. That's the story. The movies didn't exaggerate this animal. They replaced it. They took a working organism, a lizard that solved the ocean using the wrong parts, ran hot and cold water, gave birth in open blue with nothing underneath, hunted deep enough to kill its own bone, and was erased by the one thing it couldn't outswim, and swapped it for something that doesn't have to obey anything. The fossil isn't the animal. It never was. It's the shadow of one. And the shadow is still moving.